Sometimes silence hurts, but it teaches. It teaches because pain is one of the few languages the soul truly listens to. It cuts deeper than words, sharper than betrayal, and cleaner than rage. When silence comes after you've given your best, it feels cruel. When it comes from someone you trusted, it feels personal. And when it comes from life itself, it feels like abandonment. But silence is not punishment. It is the teacher of control, of understanding, of detachment. It strips away illusions and reveals the anatomy of strength. In the absence of noise, you hear what your emotions have been hiding. You discover how often you spoke to be understood by those who never cared to listen. You see how much of your worth depended on validation disguised as attention. Silence exposes the fragile architecture of ego, how it trembles when no one claps, how it starves when unseen. You realize you were never hungry for love, only for recognition. You wanted to be seen because you doubted your own visibility. That is what silence destroys first, the illusion that you need to be noticed to exist. It hurts because it feels like erasure, but it teaches because it shows that even when the world ignores you, you still remain. You survive the absence. You outlast the quiet. That is power, not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that commands the self. Most people run from silence because it mirrors their emptiness back to them. They fill it with distractions, conversations, noise, anything to avoid meeting themselves. But silence corners you. It makes you look inward. It takes everything superficial, the small talk, the approval, the performance, and leaves you naked with your thoughts. That's where you begin to rebuild. You stop seeking noise and start seeking clarity. You stop chasing validation and start cultivating peace. You learn that what you thought was loneliness was actually detox, withdrawal from chaos. You begin to understand that silence isn't absence, it's presence, the purest kind. It's where your emotions stop screaming and start speaking. It's where you realize that peace was never supposed to feel exciting. It was supposed to feel calm, steady, unshakable. Silence hurts when you still depend on others to define your worth. It hurts when your self-image is built on reactions, when you only know yourself through someone else's reflection. But once you've sat long enough with the pain, once you've let it burn through your ego's last defenses, you discover something rare, serenity. The kind of serenity that doesn't come from being understood, but from no longer needing to be. You stop explaining, defending, proving. You let people misunderstand you because you understand yourself. That's when silence turns from punishment into weapon. A quiet, elegant weapon that cuts through manipulation and control. You realize that those who demand your explanations are not seeking truth. They're seeking dominance, and silence denies them both. It starves their power. It removes their leverage. They cannot use your words against you if you refuse to speak. They cannot control your emotions if you refuse to react. Silence turns pain into armor. The more you resist the urge to explain yourself, the more mysterious you become. The more mysterious you become, the more power you hold, because mystery creates fear, not the kind born from threat, but the kind born from uncertainty. When people don't know what you're thinking, they project, they imagine, they fill the silence with their own insecurities. And in that moment, you own the narrative without saying a word. The one who stays silent controls the tempo. The one who speaks reveals their hand. But the one who listens, truly listens, begins to see the invisible patterns beneath behavior, emotion, and motive. That's what silence teaches. Perception. You start noticing things you once ignored. Tone, energy, hesitation, contradiction. You begin to sense lies before they're spoken. You read people by the spaces between their words. That's the precision of someone who has learned through pain. Silence also teaches patience, the discipline to not respond immediately, to not react to every provocation, to let time reveal what emotion conceals. It teaches that most battles are lost, not because of weakness, but because of impulsive reaction. The world provokes you to break your calm, because calm is control. It unnerves those who cannot command themselves. Silence separates the impulsive from the intentional, the emotional from the strategic. It is the invisible armor of those who understand power is not in noise, but in restraint. Yet to reach this understanding, you must pass through the hurt. You must feel the sting of being ignored, the ache of distance, the emptiness of waiting for a reply that never comes. That's how silence cleanses. It forces you to detach, to stop expecting emotional reciprocity from those incapable of it. You realize that their silence wasn't rejection, it was revelation. They showed you what they were without saying a word. In that realization, you reclaim your peace. You stop needing closure from others and start giving it to yourself. You understand that not every silence deserves to be broken, and not every person deserves an answer. The ones who leave you in silence teach you the value of presence. The ones who ghost you teach you the importance of self-respect. The ones who withhold words teach you to speak less and mean more. Silence turns heartbreak into discipline, longing into focus, pain into clarity. You begin to notice how silence refines your emotions. You cry less, but feel deeper. You speak less, but your words carry more weight. You stop chasing after people, and they start chasing after your composure. Because nothing attracts more than self-possession, the quiet assurance of someone who doesn't need to be understood to feel complete. That's the paradox. Silence hurts because it removes what you thought you needed, but it teaches because it gives you what you truly need: self-mastery. When you embrace silence, you stop being reactive and start being selective. You no longer respond to everyone, because not everyone deserves access to your energy. You no longer fight to prove your worth, because silence already proves it through composure. You no longer seek validation, because validation loses its power in the face of self-certainty. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes a memory, a mark of transformation. You no longer associate silence with loss, but with alignment. You begin to crave quiet, not because you fear noise, but because peace has become your standard. That's the evolution, from needing sound to needing stillness, from wanting attention to wanting freedom, from seeking connection to embodying control. Silence becomes your sanctuary, not your punishment. And that is how it teaches, by breaking what was never real and rebuilding what always was. Silence continues to teach long after the noise has faded. It teaches you about people, how they behave when they can no longer use words to hide their truth. When communication stops, masks fall. The person who once spoke endlessly begins to reveal their emptiness. The one who was loud to impress becomes invisible when their echo dies. You start to notice that most people don't talk to connect. They talk to distract, to fill the space that silence exposes. They fear what might rise from the quiet, the realization of how little control they have over themselves. Silence then becomes a mirror. It shows who is comfortable with their own reflection and who is terrified of it. You learn that silence is not always golden. Sometimes it's heavy, cold, and suffocating. But in that weight lies the truth. The truth that not every relationship can survive without noise, that some bonds only exist as long as words are spoken, and that when the talking stops, the foundation crumbles. This revelation doesn't make you bitter. It makes you precise. You stop confusing familiarity with connection. You stop mistaking attention for affection. You stop thinking that silence between two people means something is wrong. Sometimes it means everything is finally clear. Because silence has a way of sorting the real from the artificial. It teaches you who listens without words and who only hears themselves. It teaches you who respects distance and who sees it as neglect. It teaches you who values presence even when nothing is being said. You start to understand that the strongest relationships are not built on constant conversation, but on quiet understanding, the kind that doesn't demand explanation, the kind that survives without reassurance. In a world that glorifies expression, silence becomes rebellion. It's an act of defiance to withhold your words when everyone expects noise. It's a declaration that you are not available to every demand, not accessible to every hand that reaches for you. Silence grants you boundaries that no one can cross without permission. It gives you control over your availability, and with it control over your energy. You begin to realize that those who can't handle your silence were never meant to handle your presence. They were addicted to the version of you that performed, that entertained, that explained. But when you withdraw into quiet strength, their addiction starves. They feel your absence like a withdrawal, because silence forces them to see the imbalance. They needed your energy more than you needed theirs. That is the moment silence stops hurting. It becomes revelation. It becomes the purest filter. You see who truly values you and who only valued access to you. You stop chasing conversations and start cultivating peace. You stop demanding clarity from others and start finding it in solitude. You learn that most closure is self-created. You give yourself the words they never said, the apology they never offered, the explanation they never had the courage to give. You stop waiting for validation from those too blind to see you. Silence turns you into your own witness, not in arrogance but in awakening. You start to recognize that pain was never your enemy. It was the messenger of truth, wrapped in discomfort. It was silence's way of getting your attention, and once you finally listen, the pain no longer feels like punishment. It feels like purification. You start to understand that power has nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with composure. Those who can stay silent in chaos possess something rare, the ability to think while others panic, the ability to observe when others react, the ability to move without announcing. That kind of power cannot be faked. It's born from restraint, from the quiet endurance that comes from surviving your own storms. Silence doesn't make you emotionless, it makes you intentional. It teaches you that not every feeling deserves an audience, not every thought deserves expression. You learn to hold your emotions like sacred fire, not to suppress them, but to contain them until their release serves a purpose. That's emotional alchemy, turning reaction into response, pain into understanding, loss into strength. The silence that once hurt becomes a discipline that protects you. You start living in a different rhythm. You no longer rush to fill the void. You allow pauses in conversations. You allow space between actions. You let moments breathe. Because silence has taught you that everything meaningful grows in stillness, clarity, confidence, peace. You understand that silence is not empty. It's full of signals, insights, patterns. It sharpens your intuition. You start sensing shifts in energy before words are spoken. You know when someone is hiding something. You can tell when something has changed. That's the gift of silence. Awareness without intrusion. But awareness comes with cost. Once you see truth, you cannot unsee it. You notice insincerity more easily. You recognize manipulation faster. You detect weakness behind aggression, fear behind confidence. You see the world as it is, not as people pretend it to be. That's why silence isolates you, not because you want distance, but because most people aren't ready for that kind of clarity. They fear the person who sees too much, yet says so little. They mistake your quiet for judgment, your distance for arrogance. They don't understand that silence is not superiority. It's preservation. It's a way of maintaining purity in a world polluted by noise. And so you learn to carry your silence like a secret weapon, invisible but always present. You use it to navigate social chaos, to protect your inner world from invasion. You become the observer, not the performer. You let others speak while you analyze. You let them reveal themselves while you remain unreadable. And in that quiet invisibility, you begin to win without fighting. The more you withdraw, the clearer your path becomes. The less you speak, the more people listen when you finally do. That is the paradox of power. Those who can remain silent hold authority over those who can't. Silence teaches you control over your presence. You learn when to appear, when to withdraw, when to let absence speak louder than presence. You master timing, because silence gives you the patience to wait for the right moment instead of forcing outcomes. You start to understand that most victories in life come not from noise but from anticipation, from letting others reveal their intentions while you keep yours hidden. The silence that once broke you becomes the silence that builds you. It becomes your edge, your calm, your advantage. You no longer seek to be understood, you seek to be remembered. And you are, because silence lingers long after words are forgotten. It leaves a mark, a question, an echo. That is influence in its purest form. Silence teaches through contrast. The louder the world gets, the more valuable your quiet becomes. The deeper your silence, the more truth it reveals. And yet that revelation is not comfortable. It tears through illusions you didn't know you had. When you stop speaking, you start hearing what you've been avoiding. You hear your doubts echoing back. You hear how often your words were meant to convince yourself, not others. Silence strips away the performance of identity. It shows you what remains when no one is watching. That's why it hurts, because it forces you to meet the parts of yourself you hid behind noise. You start noticing your own dependence on reaction. You see how much of your emotional life was shaped by others' validation. You feel the hunger for acknowledgement, the panic when your presence isn't affirmed, and you begin to understand that this isn't just insecurity, it's addiction. Silence becomes your detox. It cleanses you of external noise, but also of internal chaos. The first days are torture. The absence of words feels like withdrawal. The quiet becomes unbearable because it leaves space for thought, unfiltered, raw, and confronting. But if you endure, you reach something rare, inner stillness. It's not peace that arrives suddenly, it's awareness that slowly builds. You begin to observe your emotions instead of drowning in them. You watch your thoughts pass instead of identifying with them. Silence then becomes the mind's mirror, clear, still, and honest. It reflects without distortion, and in that reflection, you see the roots of your patterns, your need to explain, your fear of being misunderstood, your compulsion to prove your worth. You see that the pain of silence was never silence itself. It was the death of illusion. The illusion that you are incomplete without noise. When this illusion dies, you are reborn into presence. You stop needing the world to echo back who you are. You become self-contained, sovereign. And that shift radiates power, the kind that makes others uneasy, because it cannot be controlled. You start to notice how silence changes social dynamics. People become unsettled around you. They talk more, trying to fill the space your composure creates. They project onto you their fears, desires, assumptions. Your calm becomes a mirror that exposes their noise. You don't need to say anything. Your restraint says enough. The more silent you are, the more others reveal themselves. It's as if your quiet draws their truth out, like a confession. That's when you understand silence as a weapon, not of aggression but of dominance. It turns you into the master of the unseen conversation. You realize that in every exchange, the one who needs to speak holds less control. The one who can wait, who can endure discomfort without reacting, always wins. Silence becomes a strategy, not of withdrawal, but of timing. You learn when to speak and when to let others bury themselves in their words. You learn that most conflicts resolve themselves when you stop feeding them with responses. You learn that attention is power, and silence is how you reclaim it. When you stop reacting, manipulation dies, drama dissolves, the noise loses its grip. You start to feel a new kind of authority, not over others, but over yourself. The silence that once felt empty now feels full of choice. Every unspoken word becomes a declaration of control. Every pause becomes a boundary. Every withheld explanation becomes a statement of strength. You realize that silence doesn't make you passive, it makes you deliberate. It gives weight to everything you eventually choose to say. And when you do speak, your words carry the gravity of restraint. They cut deeper because they are rare. People start listening not because you demand attention, but because you've made your voice scarce. That's influence through scarcity, the same principle that governs desire, respect, and authority. What is rare becomes valuable. What is abundant becomes ignored. Silence teaches you to become rare, not by vanishing, but by mastering your availability. You learn to give your energy with precision, not generosity. You stop offering your attention as charity. You let others earn it. And that shift changes everything. The people who once took you for granted start wondering what changed. They feel the void your silence leaves behind. They start questioning their own worth, their own position in your life. That's the subtle revenge of silence. It teaches others the lesson you no longer need to speak. But even that satisfaction fades, because as silence deepens, you evolve beyond reaction. You no longer care to teach anyone a lesson. You simply protect your peace. You stop seeking justice through understanding. You let life balance itself out. Silence matures from weapon to wisdom. It becomes less about others and more about your own alignment. You start to see how much energy you once wasted on noise, arguments, explanations, emotional labor. All of it drains the spirit. Silence restores it. It gives back what chaos stole. You begin to crave it, not because it isolates you, but because it centers you. Silence becomes your default state, not emptiness, but equilibrium. You realize that power isn't about control over others, it's about control over your attention. And silence is the highest form of attention, focused inward, undisturbed, sovereign. Through it, you learn to sense rather than speak, to perceive rather than perform. You start existing on a subtler level, where presence communicates more than expression ever could. You understand that most people speak because they fear being forgotten. But silence teaches you that absence can be more memorable than presence. The quiet after you leave a room speaks louder than the noise you made while inside it. The unanswered message says more than the paragraph you could have written. The calm after confrontation says more than the argument you refused to join. Silence speaks because it leaves space. Space for imagination, for reflection, for uncertainty. And uncertainty is power. Because when people cannot predict you, they cannot control you. When they cannot read you, they cannot manipulate you. When they cannot reach you, they start reaching for themselves. That is the essence of psychological power. To influence without forcing. To lead without demanding. To teach without preaching. Silence makes you that kind of force. Quiet, steady, unforgettable. And though it hurt when it began, now you see that pain as sacred initiation. You were not being punished, you were being refined. Silence was sculpting you into something unshakable, someone who doesn't need to be loud to be heard, or seen to be felt. You become the storm in still water, invisible, but powerful enough to move everything around you. And once you've learned this language, you can never go back to noise. Silence, once unbearable, becomes your greatest teacher, the quiet professor that speaks in absence, not sound. It begins to reveal the deeper architecture of emotion, thought, and motive. You start to see that silence doesn't only change how you relate to others, it transforms how you relate to yourself. When the world goes quiet, you no longer have the luxury of distraction. You can no longer hide behind activity or conversation. You face the raw data of your inner world, your fears, your insecurities, your doubts. At first, this confrontation feels merciless. You realize how much of your identity was constructed through reaction. You were what others made you feel. You were what they thought, what they mirrored back. You existed in a constant state of reflection, but silence ends that mirror game. It removes the feedback loop. Suddenly, you must define yourself without witnesses. That is where the transformation begins. You start to see that most of your pain was born not from silence itself, but from your resistance to it. You fought against stillness because it revealed your dependency. You weren't addicted to love, you were addicted to noise, to the assurance that someone was there, that you were being seen, that you mattered. But when the silence stretches long enough, you are forced to rebuild meaning from within. You discover that your worth was never in being heard, but in being whole. You start doing things alone, not as punishment, but as practice. You eat alone, you walk alone, you think without narrating it to someone else. At first, it feels like exile. Then it begins to feel like freedom. Silence stops being isolation and becomes independence. You start to feel self-contained, untouchable, like a closed circuit of energy that no longer leaks. The approval that once sustained you loses its flavor. The attention that once thrilled you starts to feel cheap. You realize how much peace you traded for validation. And you no longer want the bargain. The hurt that once made you ache for answers now makes you smile in understanding. You see that the silence wasn't meant to punish you, it was meant to purify you. It separated what was real from what was temporary. It exposed who could stand with you in stillness and who disappeared when the applause stopped. It taught you that not everyone is capable of meeting you in silence, because silence demands depth, and most people fear drowning. You begin to respect the few who can share your quiet, the ones who don't fill the air with words, but with presence. You start valuing those rare souls who can sit beside you without trying to fix, explain, or entertain. In that simplicity, connection becomes sacred again, stripped of performance, grounded in peace. You realize that silence has changed your standards. You no longer crave intensity, you crave stability. You no longer seek excitement, you seek resonance. You no longer want to be understood by many. You want to be aligned with few. This is the wisdom that only silence can teach, that peace is the ultimate luxury and not everyone can afford it. But silence teaches you something else, something subtler, that control over the external world is an illusion, and the only power that endures is internal command. You start to see life itself differently. You stop expecting fairness. You stop demanding closure. You stop taking things personally. Silence trains you to observe rather than absorb. When people hurt you, you stop reacting immediately. You wait. You listen to what isn't being said. You begin to sense that every action, every word, every insult is just a reflection of where the other person is in their own war with themselves. Silence allows you to step out of that battlefield. It gives you the perspective of the mountain, not the soldier. You become untouchable, not because you are indifferent, but because you understand too deeply to be shaken. And with that, silence becomes spiritual. It becomes the language of understanding without interference, of clarity without noise. You start communicating differently, slower, fewer words, more weight. You let pauses linger. You watch people rush to fill them, revealing everything. You realize that the less you say, the more others expose. You start mastering tension, that invisible pressure between what's known and unknown. You use it without cruelty, but with awareness. Because tension draws focus and silence is the birthplace of tension. In stillness, you hold others' attention without demanding it. You make people wonder. You make them feel. You become memorable, not because you shouted, but because you stayed quiet when others would have broken. That kind of restraint is power, the rarest kind. It commands respect even from those who don't understand it. And soon you realize that silence no longer hurts. It used to burn, but now it cleanses. It used to feel like rejection, but now it feels like refinement. It teaches that the absence of words often says more than their abundance. It teaches that distance is sometimes the purest form of respect, for yourself and for others. It teaches that presence without peace is still emptiness. The lessons compound. You start to notice how silence is interwoven with all forms of mastery. The greatest thinkers retreat into it. The strongest warriors move in it. The wisest minds listen through it. Even nature speaks it. Mountains, oceans, stars. Power has always been quiet. Noise belongs to insecurity. The more fragile the ego, the louder it becomes. The more anchored the spirit, the quieter it grows. You start embodying that truth. You stop defending yourself. You stop trying to prove what time will reveal. You stop explaining your decisions to people who never earned that intimacy. Silence teaches you that not every truth must be spoken to be real. Some truths are meant to be lived, not shared. Some lessons are meant to be carried, not taught. You understand now that the greatest strength is invisible. Composure under pressure, patience in chaos, quiet understanding in the face of noise. And so, your silence no longer hurts. It guides. It tells you when to walk away, when to wait, when to act. It tells you that peace is more expensive than pride, and you must protect it accordingly. You start moving differently, speaking differently, even thinking differently. Every gesture becomes deliberate. Every word becomes sacred. You no longer fill space, you create it. You no longer seek control, you embody it. That's when silence becomes your signature, your power code. It's not the absence of communication, it's communication at its highest frequency, calm, precise, unreadable. And through it, you become what the noisy world secretly envies, someone who doesn't need attention to feel powerful or words to be understood. Silence is no longer a lesson you endure. It becomes a language you master. You begin to realize that its power does not lie in absence but in direction, where it's placed when it's used, and how it shapes perception. Silence used carelessly isolates, but silence used with awareness transforms. You start using it not to hide but to command. In a conversation, your quiet becomes a force that shapes the rhythm. People lean in when you pause. They reveal more when you withhold. They fill the space you've left open with their own truth, unaware that you've guided them there through restraint. Silence makes you the conductor of unseen dialogue. You no longer compete to be heard. You simply make others listen. Because silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. You've seen how those who rush to speak always lose control. The moment they explain, they surrender mystery. The moment they justify, they expose insecurity. But you no longer fall into that trap. You let others underestimate you while you observe. You let them assume, project, and misinterpret, because in the end, perception is their prison, not yours. You no longer need to correct the narrative. Silence teaches you that truth doesn't require defense, it only requires time. Everything false collapses under its own noise. Everything real sustains itself in quiet endurance. So you let people talk, you let rumors spread, you let assumptions grow, because silence will always reveal what sound tries to hide. You trust that clarity arrives not through confrontation, but through patience. And in that patience, you find your greatest power, emotional control. You stop being ruled by impulses. You stop explaining your absence. You stop apologizing for your peace. You understand that silence is not withdrawal. It's refinement. It filters who can meet you at your new frequency. The ones who can't handle it disappear. The ones who can remain. Silence doesn't take from you. It aligns you. It surrounds you with those who value energy over effort, presence over performance. And in that environment, you begin to grow differently. Your mind sharpens. Your emotions stabilize. Your actions become precise. You begin to sense that silence is not the opposite of expression, but its highest form. Every movement, every look, every decision becomes an unspoken message. You start to communicate without noise, through consistency, through calm, through restraint. That's when people begin to sense your presence even when you're not around. You've transcended visibility. You've become influence without exposure. That's the final stage of silence, invisibility that still commands. You're no longer part of the chatter. You've become the calm at the center of it, and the world feels your absence as power because absence, when owned, becomes presence magnified. You realize that silence has completed its purpose. It has hurt you, cleansed you, shaped you, and now it serves you. It's not a prison, it's your discipline. It's the invisible proof of your evolution. The same quiet that once burned your chest now guards your peace. You no longer fear it. You return to it. You choose it. You understand that real confidence doesn't need to announce itself. Real peace doesn't need to be shared. Real strength doesn't demand recognition. Silence was never about muting yourself. It was about mastering timing. And now you know exactly when to speak, not from emotion, but from intention. When you do, your words land like truth, not noise. They carry the weight of absence, the credibility of restraint. People listen differently, not because you are loud, but because you are rare. That is the legacy of silence. It turns scarcity into strength. It makes your voice valuable because it's no longer impulsive, it's deliberate. You've learned that silence hurts only when you resist it. Once you surrender, it transforms you into something untouchable. You move through life like water, soft yet unstoppable, quiet yet undeniable. And as you look back, you realize that every moment of quiet pain was a preparation for calm power. Every ignored message, every unanswered question, every quiet night alone, all of it was training. Silence wasn't punishing you, it was fortifying you. It was teaching you to breathe without attention, to feel without validation, to live without noise. And now that you have mastered it, the world looks different. You no longer need to chase understanding, because you've become understanding itself. You no longer seek connection because you attract it naturally. You no longer fear solitude because you see it as strength. Silence taught you what words never could, that power begins when reaction ends, that love deepens when need dissolves, that clarity arrives when the noise dies. So you stay quiet, not out of pride but out of peace. You let others speak while you listen, not to reply but to perceive. You let life unfold in its rhythm without forcing it. You trust timing because silence trained you to. And as you sit in that final stillness, you understand the truth that silence always tried to whisper. What hurts you now is shaping the voice of your future calm. Pain was never the end. It was the cleansing before strength. The silence that once wounded you became the silence that protects you. And that is the paradox of power. It never shouts. It never pleads. It never proves. It simply stands still, calm, and undeniable. Silence isn't the absence of power. It's the proof of it. Subscribe, because real power doesn't shout, it whispers.